Welcome, Sir Bill English. This is part of a series which is meant to try to get engagement between policymakers, whether current or former policymakers, and academics. And of course, it's great to then have a former Prime Minister, Sir Bill English, who really, I think, transformed the sort of data landscape in New Zealand, and which you'll learn about. To really just perhaps start a dialogue about how one might sort of use that data in New Zealand, but also use the same approach in other countries to also be able to answer a wide range of questions. Just before I Bill English speaks, I'll just give a very brief overview of what the linked data allows one to do. And a project I was involved in with some New Zealand researchers gives an illustration of perhaps from the sort of grand theory down to the practice and how it might inform future decision-making in New Zealand. And if I can turn here. So if we turn to something like counting health expenditure, and of course for governments, they really need to have an understanding of how much they're spending on things, as well as researchers having an idea of where that money is going. And in most countries, that's just simply broken down into broad aggregates, such as the sort of curative expenditure, which is normally hospitals, medical expenditures, which might be primary care. And I think then, what governments really know is how much they spend, because of course they know they pay the bills, as it were, but they really don't have a good understanding of where that money exactly is being spent. And this is where one needs integrated and linked data to really be able to understand not only how much is being spent, but where it's being spent, and in particular, perhaps focusing on individual diseases. Now, what one is able to do, and this is very much down to the Bill English being able to link up the data. All of the data in New Zealand, the health data, is linked together through in a protected system, which is called the integrated data infrastructure. And so that protects privacy and anonymity, but it allows one to get an overall picture of how much is being spent on a person, whether that be on hospitals, from data from cancer registries, from primary care data or drug data. And of course, this ends up being a lot of data, 5 million people and 18 million years of data. And as you can see, but what we then get is a very good understanding of where the funding is flowing by disease. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we've got a set of graphs to try and statistically allocate disease expenditure down to a fairly fine level over the life course for males and females. And for example, showing that musculoskeletal diseases are a key driver of health expenditure, and various other diseases, neurological diseases and so forth, also drive expenditure. So that's something that most countries do not have, that sort of picture, fine-grained picture that we do now have for New Zealand. But also, I think importantly with the data integration is it goes beyond a single sector such as health. And here's an illustration of where we can combine health and tax records to get a broader picture. And of course, if people are sick, they often then means they can't go to work. And of course, that means the country, individuals have less income and a country has less income. And so we were able to link the records again in this protected environment. With New Zealand researchers, we're able to link the records and then get an idea of how much diseases impact on overall the income of a country, as it were. And we are able to quantify that and break it down by disease. This sort of analysis really isn't possible in all but a few countries, because there isn't really the same sort of linkage between one sector and another. In New Zealand also, potentially one that is able then to link in other sectors such as education and so forth. Without further ado, I'll then hand over to Sir Bill English. And as I said, not only was he Prime Minister, but formerly he was Finance Minister, and I think previously a Health Minister, as well as working in Treasury, and I think doing 2 university degrees, including one in English and in commerce. So I think he's very well placed, obviously, to talk about this bridge or divide, or trying to link academia with public policy. So without further ado, thanks, Bill.
Well, thank you very much, Philip, for that excellent introduction. And in addition to the CV, just to, I suppose, emphasise that there's a practicality about what I'm going to talk about. Since I left politics in early 2018, we have invested in a number of businesses, which I think in essence are about a retail function for research into charities. That is, we take a lot of the very good work that's done by social researchers, such as the IDI exercise you went through yourself, and turn that into operational decisions that can be made in our case by charities, and certainly by government. It's just that government is a pretty hard customer. So I think that's just underscoring the fact that what I'm going to talk about is about the practicality of how to do a lot of good things better than they're currently done. I'll just go back briefly through the history of the IDI, the Integrated Data Infrastructure, but then talk about some case studies of its usage. Now, bear in mind, I'm coming from a particular point of view, which is a specifically non-research point of view. I represented a large rural electorate for a long time, 27 years, in the far south of the South Island, next stop Antarctica, and combining that experience with a lot of smaller communities, with roles in education, and our Minister of Health for a number of years, and then a finance minister starting in 2008, just as the GFC turned up, and therefore responsible for the, for a number of years of fiscal restraint and reconstruction through to 2017 when I left politics after being Prime Minister for a year. So and since then, commercially, creating businesses built around some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about as a kind of ultimate market test of whether people are willing to pay for the outputs of something like the IDI. When I turned up in 2009-10, I had, as background, been involved in a pretty hard-edged austerity drive in the early 90s. In New Zealand, where we went through a massive economic reconstruction. And the hard edge of that was my communities, which were subsidised farming communities, and the subsidies disappeared. We had significant social and economic dislocation. And then I entered Parliament in 1990, we're in a pretty grim period in New Zealand, actually, as it dealt with the fallout from that economic restructuring, which took some years to bear fruition. And just in response to the question, there's no slides. So burned into my brain, I think, was the view that there must be smarter ways of doing a better job for people who really need it, particularly the most vulnerable in our community. Now, as it happened in about 2009, I kind of stumbled on the IDI. This was originally it was set up by Kiwi, initiated really by Kiwi, who's now a professor at New York University, who wanted to look at firm-level data for business and economic analysis, particularly of labour markets. And it struck me as probably very useful for a couple of things. One is understanding what happens to people. And it never ceased to amaze me in quite a long period in politics how senior people running large monopoly institutions such as a education system or a health system, how little they actually knew about what happened to people who weren't, when those people weren't in their system. So if you talk to a bureaucracy, they classify people according to the institution they're in contact with. So they're pupils, they're prisoners, they're patients, they're pensioners. That's the 4 Ps of the apocalypse. And of course, that is only a slice of their life. And the rhetoric of all of those institutions goes like this: don't expect too much from us. Like, don't expect the health bureaucratic structure to make people healthy, because the drivers of health are elsewhere. And the same with education. They say, don't expect us to really educate the most disadvantaged, because the drivers of their disadvantage aren't to do with education, they're to do with, poverty and family structure, and so on. And I have to say, this, as a finance minister, this is very frustrating, because these people come in and bid for hundreds of millions of dollars with claims about what it will achieve. And those claims are generally exaggerated and coexist with this other rhetoric about how it's everyone else's fault that I didn't succeed in changing lives. So the IDI provided an opportunity to see what actually happens to those lives. In universalist public systems, they don't know. And I think it's really important to understand that. Health systems don't know what happens, particularly to the bottom 15 or 20% of the highest risk 15 to 20% of their population. They blame everyone else, but they don't know what happens outside their health system. And when you're the finance minister, you've got this constant stream of claims. I've been in the public policy for over 30 years. And if you believed any of the claims, then we would have solved all these problems 30 years ago with more money, because there's a hell of a lot more money. I'll just give you a figure, some statistics from recent New Zealand experience. In the last 6 years, health expenditure has risen 60%. There are 27% more doctors and nurses, and the output is the same as 6 years ago. That is, inpatient, outpatient discharges, GP visits are roughly the same, which means as a proportion of the population are dropping because the population's growing. So you've got to be a skeptic about the claims of the universalist system. In my view, there's 30 or 40 years of failure for the bottom end. The universalist system has reached its limit of what it can achieve. So the IDI enables, which is just linked data across government under all the appropriate protections, cybersecurity, privacy, confidentiality, under the Department of Statistics in New Zealand, a Australian Bureau of Statistics in Australia. I'm not sure the equivalent in the UK. But it allows you to link data so you can see what actually happens to real people, independent of the power structures of the monopoly bureaucracy. There's no point asking a health bureaucracy what happens to the kids they deal with in education. They have absolutely no interest in that. There's no point in asking the prison system what happens with 16-year-olds who aren't in prison but are inevitably on their way there. So it gives you this incredibly rich picture of the life course of any cohort or individual, unnamed, unknowable, that you would want. And that gives you profound insights about policy and operations of government. And in particular, as we use the IDI to analyse people's use of public services and as researchers use it, what becomes really clear is described by something we call the Mason curve, because it was named after an official who first thought of it, the public servant. When you map intensity of need over time, about 85% of the population use 50% of public services, and the highest risk 15% use the other half of all public services. And the system's designed for the 85%, like intentionally. That's not a profound insight. Universalism is about 85% of the population getting a commodity product that basically works for them. And that's been verified with this integrated linked data with 10 to 30 years of historical data backed up with it. So profound insight. What are some of those insights? Well, I'll just give you a couple of little, a couple of case studies. We applied it probably most comprehensively to the welfare system, where the chief executive of and it's called MSD here, Ministry of Social Development, which pays out the benefits to the beneficiary population. We, given this life course view, calculated a future liability, which from a finance minister's point of view is absolutely legitimate. What is the future cost of this population? Treasuries around the world are obsessed with the aging population. Well, you actually can't change that much. People are going to age, doesn't matter what policy you have. But with the welfare population, the under 65s, it's actually amenable to change. So the chief executive had a performance agreement which said, see this liability, which at the time, I think this is numbers are out of date, was 70 billion. Get that down and use your existing 600 million of free cash flow to reduce it. Well, it changed the focus of the bureaucracy from the unemployed, where life course analysis shows you they get jobs if they're on the unemployment benefit. There's some who don't, there's some that are long-term. But there's two other groups who have large long-term costs and but are amenable to change now in the short term. So one is solo parents under 20. The other is all the other young people under 20. And a third group is those who are in the kind of grey zone between unemployment, sickness and disability, a proportion of which can actually get work if they get the right support. And this is where we bring in investment thinking. So the way we turn the IDI analysis into real impact on people's lives and the lives of people on, I think, what they call pensions in the UK, but benefits here, was to literally, and I mean literally, do a net present value calculation where you have a predictive model. What's likely to happen to these people if nothing is done? And then what are we willing to spend now, and think of it as investment because it's an injection of resource now to get long-term benefits. What are we willing to spend now to change this life course? And it turns out that young solo parents are highly amenable. And in New Zealand, there's not that many of them actually. And we embarked on a program that dealt with them individually because the calculation told us it was worth spending up to 50,000 a year, NZ dollars, on these young women, mainly or overwhelmingly young women, to make sure to get their education, to make sure their bills were paid so that they didn't suffer from transience. They got their power bills paid, make sure their power bills were paid, keep the dodgy, violent boyfriend away. Because individually, the investment was worthwhile. A bit of a sad story about the grey zone of sickness, health, disability, unemployment, where we actually set up some outcome-driven contracts in that case. The government bureaucracy was very concerned that it was successful, and so they stopped referring people to it because the success rates outside of the government agency were 65% and inside the government agency 15%. And that's 15%, and that's just because the government agency never really paid attention to it. They were much more focused on the unemployed. They didn't have the skills to know how to enable people with mild disabilities to stick to employment, and they didn't know how to contract for it. They were hopeless. But anyway, with the change of government, they managed to kill that scheme. There was other pretty profound insights. We did quite a big exercise on the highest risk 1% of children. There's endless rhetoric about prevention, about early intervention, about early childhood education. So we thought we'd test the system. What happens to the highest risk 1%, the first percentile of kids? Well, it was, as you can imagine, a chapter of complexity and difficulty for those kids. A couple of striking things. One is that they use an enormous amount of public services. And you think, well, when you know that the net present value of their public service use is, $1 million before they turn 30, and for a male in that cohort, there's a 70% chance of incarceration, wouldn't you do something about it? Well, the universalist system doesn't want to because it's too hard, and resisted all change to focus in on those kids, mainly using an argument about stigmatizing them. Well, if you're growing up in a violent, drug-addled household, you're already stigmatized. I don't think they're too worried about what labels put on them. Another startling insight from that was that 20% of those kids managed to achieve the higher school certificate, the sort of 16-year-old educational qualification, which in New Zealand is proven to be a very reliable benchmark of improving your future prospects. And I still recall sitting in a large group of officials saying, okay, who knows why those kids succeed? Well, no one knew, but even sadder, no one seemed that interested. And you think about the rhetoric about children. This has made me skeptical about the kind of pro-social rhetoric of so many analysts, statisticians, researchers, but particularly public servants, because in the face of that pretty amazing statistic, 20% of the bottom 1% of kids achieve something that by our normal measures is a successful path in life. They had no interest. I think, well, where's your interest in the potential of children and these, and getting out of deficit thinking? So, I suggested we get in vans and go out to some of our hard, low socioeconomic areas and ask those kids, because I did that myself. But unfortunately, I got moved on to Prime Minister and we didn't quite get to see it through. Just one other case study is what the longitudinal view does, the life course view based on the integrated data. The integrated data, just keep this in mind, the integrated data is fantastic for researchers, but what really makes it come alive for politicians is the life stories. That's what really makes it live. And if I want to use corporate language, because I'm part of the corporate world, it's customer focused, which your mainstream system isn't unless you're in a really bad way. The mainstream system is focused on its institutional growth and survival, not on the customers. And it shouldn't, you can see why not, because most of the institutions who deliver these services are monopolies. Whether they get a customer or don't get a customer doesn't matter. And in fact, they couch most of their interaction with normal people as dealing with overwhelming demand, which actually is not true. Demand's not overwhelming. It's a political construct. But in order to demonstrate this, this is just one out of many stories. One of the sort of tropes in New Zealand social policy is the child in a house with poor insulation who gets bad bronchial and other related maladies and turns up at a hospital. So I said, okay, let's track one, because I'm a great believer in the idea nothing's changed until you've changed it for one real person. Doesn't matter how many conferences and papers you've written. Did we operationally change things for one person? So we tracked one child, actually from a state house, from a government-owned house, who turned up at one of our busiest EDs. Well, 6 months later, it was a chapter of exhaustion, incompetence, lack of focus. And at the end of 6 months, this particular child, who I don't know who it was still sick. The mother and the child were still in an awful state house with damp, moss on the walls, mold on the walls. But worse, she was bitter and mistrustful. And a significant amount of resource had been applied to that case ineffectively. And this was simply with two public agencies, health and state housing, public housing, who both know all the research, both know what you're meant to do, but exhibited a kind of lassitude about actually doing the thing that mattered. So the value of linked data is that it starts showing you these stories, and it starts showing you the limitations of the existing models, and it starts showing you why some problems seem intractable. So the point I came to was that the bottom 15% get very bad service. If you apply middle class norms, and we're all, educated middle class, we would not put up with it. And it's no wonder that these people end up exhausted, bitter, and mistrustful of the state. And that makes it even harder to reach them. In fact, I'd say in New Zealand, and I suspect it's similar, the dysfunction of the universalist services is part of the pathology of poverty, because it sucks up so much of their resource, of the resource of the people who they're meant to be helping. But of course, when you think, why does that persist? Well, because the data tells you should change how you deliver. And that's where the barriers arise, because in a universalist system is very resistant to change. In the end, they'll have to, everyone ended up with an iPhone. In the end, everyone's going to end up having to deliver customized service. And if it takes 10 years or 20 years, well, that's just another 10 or 20 years of misery. But in the end, it'll happen, because humans like to know things. And once they know things, they can't not know things. Now, so what we were doing, and the new government is about to reignite all this. In New Zealand, we had a government for 6 years who thought that counting people meant you didn't care. So they just scrapped all the IDI-related, data-related stuff and resorted to probably the most retro version of the universalist welfare state, where who delivers it mattered a hell of a lot more than whether it made any difference. And the result was like the health stats that I talked about, 60% increase in expenditure and no increase in throughput. And is throughput an economic extreme right-wing concept? No, it's real people who are not getting their disease or their treatment that they actually not only need, but actually deserve to get in a civilised society with a competent government. So the new government's about to ignite all this. So if you just think of it as, you know, I know this language often offends people who work in social policy, but it's actually powerful. And that is here's two ideas. Apply investment thinking to human capital. You know, we have our modern welfare states have done a great job of giving everyone a bit of, you know, the roughly health that they need, education, access to education, and income support. We've done the good job of that. But the next step is actually personalising it, and linked data enables you to do that. And the second thing is apply investment thinking. And again, I know that's not a concept that rests easy with the sort of social research community or with a lot of public policy people, but that's the reality of people's lives. Actually, you know, they're not averages. They're not ethnic categories, which are, you know, a bit of a big deal in New Zealand, with Māori, Pacific Asian making up about 40% of the population now. They are individuals with needs, and the point of the spending is to change the trajectory, or as I would put it, we're here to reduce the misery, not feed off it. And it's quite a good test. So we've carried this through into investing in businesses that measure that change. And ironically, we found that charities and corporates are much more interested in that than public agencies. They really do want to know first how to impress their funders by showing that they can change trajectory of lives. Not everybody, and I'll come back to that. And secondly, just how to do it better. They just got a motivation to do good better, and using the research that the research community produces, combined with algorithms of public and their own organisational data, we can give them a bit of advice about how to make those changes in trajectory. So over the next few years, we're going to get a bit of a live experiment in all this. We got a government elected just 6 months ago, which is looking at a program of fiscal constraint, because debt New Zealand has got high, not as high as the UK, but it's pretty high. And in a small open economy, we can't sustain that for too long. And they are actively looking at this concept of social investment, that is deciding where you can spend now for long-term benefits. And just the final point I'd make is treasuries don't like this stuff. And they don't like the thinking for a couple of reasons. They think you can't capture the benefits in the fiscal accounts, and they're wrong about that. And I'll give you an example. And they also don't like the kind of long-term commitment that it implies. You know, if you really want a provider of service to change how a community operates, you know, to reduce diabetes by changing the dietary habits in a highly intensive need community, you need 10-year commitment, not 1 year, not 2 years. But actually, our bureaucracies aren't serious. They don't actually believe all the stuff they say about permanence of the institutions and about prevention, because in my experience, they won't commit because somehow it reduces their power. If they say, well, you can have a contract for 10 years, it means I can't mess around with it for 10 years. And what's even worse, you might turn out to be better at doing this than the government agency. And they really don't like competition. And I know I sound a bit sceptical, but I've spent 30 years on it, and I've come to those those sort of conclusions. However, we've got an opportunity in New Zealand with the new government to have another crack at it. And there's some groups in our communities who have been very badly served. We're involved in the disability community through family and also business operations. In most Western countries, the disability community has been a bit of a scrap heap. Government agencies regard it as not very sexy, but there's an intense need in there, and relatively small proportions of success can make a big difference. If you can get 10% of the population to a situation where they can work, or where they can exercise their personal preferences to give them some sense of control in their lives, that's a massive step forward. So just to sum up, linked data gives you a deep, rich view of people's lives, which without the linked data you can't see. And it enables changes in the delivery of service, and that's the key bit. There's no point in all the analysis unless it leads to changes in delivery of service. And in New Zealand, we've done that by just going outside the universal delivery system and creating alternative means of integrated delivery in highly deprived communities. There's a long way to go there to make it really work well, but it looks like the most promising way to change actual services for real people is go outside the mainstream system, because it's shown itself to be pretty much incapable of the kind of change that can be wrought by current data and technology systems and knowledge of the customers. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks very much, Bill, and obviously a very sort of, I suppose, provocative talk. I think please put questions in the chat. I think Sophie's going to monitor those. Perhaps just to start off, one of the things that really strikes me about your talk is you're really focusing, as it were, on the bottom in terms of the most vulnerable, whereas often people and researchers, including the work I presented earlier, really focuses on the average, so what we're sort of interested in. And I think it's an interesting question about, of course, from a finance point of view, that's clearly the case, that the bottom are really driving expenditure. But I suppose perhaps the reverse, that if you can move the average with something like life expectancy, you're obviously, or the median person, you're obviously going to have a great benefit across the community. Is it worth, are there examples, or did you use it at all for thinking about these sort of, population level interventions, as it were?
Look, that goes on anyway. But we have a little look. My views about this are conditioned by really two things. One is as a finance minister, and the other is as now a shareholder in businesses that work with that are targeted on the bottom 15%. And our little meme is the average is the enemy of the truth. So the average is fine when you're working through the medium of large bureaucratic institutions. That's what they were set up to do, right? They were set up to shift the average, and they've done a reasonable job of that. But if you believe their rhetoric, right, which is that they're worried about the most vulnerable, then shifting the average is no good to the most vulnerable. And the techniques that shift the average don't shift the most vulnerable. They live in a very complex world of mistrust, of punishment, of little bits of commodity service that somehow they're expected to stitch together, when we've said to them they're not that well educated and they're impoverished and no one cares about them. It looks a bit negative. So, yep, look, there's a job to do there, shifting the average, fine. But let's not pretend that that's doing the other job.
Okay, no, that's good. Thanks. Sophie, over to you, just to pull some questions from the chat.
Yes, we have a few questions in the chat now. The first one is, if you as Prime Minister can't change the system, should we all quit, or should we vote to rule on manifestos? Start off lightly.
Well, as Finance Minister, I had a bit more to say. over this stuff than as Prime Minister, I suppose. Yeah, look, we made mistakes about implementation and clarity. I think the mistake we made was assuming that the institutions were able to change. And it wasn't until we started reaching outside department, health, education, welfare agencies, that we started getting some progress. But we get a test now because the current government has a lot of the rhetoric of what we in New Zealand call social investment. And I think a lot of lessons learned from our period, sort of 2010 to 2016, which was when we did a lot of the intensive learning. Because the key to data is that you set up feedback loops. So there's a feedback loop, including at the Prime Minister's office, what actually works here. And here's a couple of lessons. One is collaboration does not work. Okay? Do not expect the elephants to dance the gay Gordons. They're not going to do it. There's nothing about our current universalist institutions that encourages them to work with anyone else. We wasted years and lots of energy on trying to get collaboration, and many other governments have made the same mistake. Number one. Number two is, if you're really concerned about prevention and social determinants of health and whether education is meant to lift, provide a ladder for the people with the most disadvantage, then you need to focus on trusted relationships with families and communities. That's the core of it. We've done about 300, through our business, 300 measures of social return on investment. And that's become a consistent theme. Where there's trusted relationships with families and communities, you get progress. It happens that those are exactly the things that your mainstream agencies can't do and were never set up to do. So you can't expect them to. So, yep, couldn't change it. Didn't get enough time as Prime Minister, only got a year. But I had 8 years as Finance Minister, learned the lessons, and now the current government will get to apply them. And let's see in 3 or 4 years' time how far we get.
Thank you. And we have another question, which is, could you please say a bit more about how IDI research outcomes have improved services delivered by or decisions made by charities, which you referred to at the start?
Oh, okay. Well, look, it's a contributor. So, as we know, in delivering services, there's normally no one thing that's decisive. You've got to have competent provision, good governance, well-informed decision makers, good frontline systems. So we use the IDI in our algorithm for charities to show the predictive change, and we find it's a powerful motivator for them. If they're running a mentoring service or financial literacy or intensive family support, the fact that they can have a counterfactual, that is, if we do nothing, this is what's going to happen to this family. If we have a sensible intervention we use a global research base to inform all this, based on the best research available, and we turn that into actionable statements about what they can actually decide to do in a charity that's got 15 employees. They can see what change they can make, and that's profoundly motivational. And often the motivation turns into simple things like, can we count our people? How come half the families drop out at 3 months when we run a 12-month course, a 12-month program? Why is it that some of our social workers, when we think about it, can deal with 50 families and others can deal with 10? Or should they only be dealing with 10? We don't supply answers to those questions, but it gets people thinking in quite a focused way about what their model of change actually is. And of course, that's not a new idea. There's lots of people have that kind of, the intervention logic approach. But we found that the the process we use for measuring your social return on investment, probably in about 90% of cases, leads to significant change in how they deliver services. And the IDI data is, in New Zealand, sort of a standardised part of that, because the IDI delivers standardised change values. So just by way of example, here's a Samoan 14-year-old girl, whose education statistics are generally not that good. What difference does it make if she gets the NCA level 2, that is the 16-year-old qualification? Well, it turns out it makes a big difference. So you tell a charity that. Charities don't know any of this stuff. All they just get this endless rhetoric, how if you're poor and you're brown, you're hopeless. And what they need actually is a bit of data and information that says, if you do this thing, you can change these lives. And that's profoundly motivational.
Sophie, other questions?
Yes. Thanks for your thought-provoking talk. Could you please give an example of some of the alternatives that New Zealand is now working with people from deprived communities? Okay, well, there's one of the, I'll give you one good example. So I was in the centre-right government, and we found ourselves in coalition with a Indigenous nationalist party by the name of the Māori Party, the Māori being our Indigenous, New Zealand's Indigenous people. And they have a strong view that they've been colonised by the welfare state, and that the welfare state has created dependency, multi-generational dependency. They had an equally strong positive view that whānau, which is their word for family, is a source of strength. And their word for health is ora. So whānau ora is the sort of well-being of the family. So we initiated a pretty large-scale program which operates outside of all the government agencies, called whānau ora. And it is integrated purchasing of support services for families under some stress. And I have to say it has been welcomed with open arms by that community, which in New Zealand's quite a big community, 10 or 12% of the population, with a lot of the features of disadvantage that you'd expect. And it has been mercifully free of the short-termism of treasuries, budget rounds, and government agencies. And it's developing confidence and competence in improving outcomes for those families, at least in part according to the family's view of what they regard as success. And that's a breakthrough. It's the customer deciding what matters, not the public policy bureaucrat. And we have this, we're involved in a disability business. It's actually a policy that's structured around the same principles. What matters to them often is not what matters to the public policy expert or the researcher, number one. And number two is they often have a very nuanced idea of what is going to change their lives. And, it could be, there's family violence going on, and, what's going to change their lives is so the kids can get to school, is, someone actually confronting the perpetrator of the family violence, instead of the usual system. We came across a case where the police called on one household 85 times in a year. How dumb is that? That is a dumb, expensive, useless system. And that dynamic is replicated every day in every welfare state in the Western world. Police turn up 85 times to one household. So, the 16-year-old girl will tell you, Dad's out of control.
do something, get his auntie who he'll listen to and fix it. And then I'll be able to go to school because I don't have to stay home to protect my mother. That's it's got to lead to that kind of grittiness. And the Whānau Ora program enables the kind of funding flexibility that agencies don't like, but it enables an expression of the preferences of the customer, of the household and the community about what's going to work in their community. Do you really think people wandering around Westminster or Wellington really feel and know what's going to work in deprived communities? Well, I'm absolutely convinced the answer is no.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I suppose one question, there are several questions in the chat just about how you build public trust. Obviously, linking up data, that you've got to take citizens with you. How did you achieve that in New Zealand, and were there any sort of problems along the way?
Yes, many. But yes, I mean, the main thing that we did, which I have to say I was reluctant about at first, but turned out to be the right thing. I was wrong and they were right, was putting it under, in our case, the Department of Statistics, who are, rigidly careful about the use and re-identification and all those issues. We always found that the public are rightly sceptical about bureaucracies who just want to harvest data. And that's what a lot of them do. We spend millions, hundreds of millions just collecting stuff. What you need to do is make the case for value. What's the value to the community of linking this data and feeding it back to them? That's a great test. And we ended up getting a lot better at it, learning the hard way with people, starting out very, very suspicious. And I think that's critical. I mean, consumer control of data. Where we're going is individuals control their own data. That's who owns it. The real problem, actually, what we found was communities were amenable to that discussion. Sometimes it's a bit tough, but you take your time to get there. The people who really don't like it are government agencies. This idea that the public are obsessed with privacy. Government agencies are obsessed with control. Well, in the long run, they're going to lose because the technology is there for everyone to know anything, anytime now for nothing. And that's what we've invested in our businesses. Knowing stuff now is dead cheap and easy. And you've got these big institutions who act like it's still a specialised function like it was in 1956. We had to be tertiary educated in a bureaucracy to know statistics and statistical methods. Well, 12-year-olds just use the algorithm. I mean, it's a nonsense, really. No, the big problem wasn't the public and won't be in the future. The big problem is government agencies who think they can control the flow of information and data, and they'll die in a ditch doing it. I was really impressed with their resilience, their stubbornness, their resourcefulness when it came to patrolling the boundaries of their institutional power. And frankly, getting out of politics, we've set out to invest in systems and businesses that undermine that, because it's ridiculous. It's not their data. And they fail, they ignore the law. In New Zealand, they just ignored the law. And that's why it needs political will, right? And fortunately, now we've got a government with a political will. And we're already starting to see the system reorientate and start to think, okay, we're going to have to be useful now instead of negative.
Thanks very much. Perhaps just one final question, slightly off topic, but perhaps to raise something else New Zealand's well known for, and that's being nuclear free. And I think a former Prime Minister, David Lange, who I believe debated Jerry Falwell here in Oxford, in the Oxford Union, about the pros and cons of being nuclear free. But I believe it's been adopted and it's kind of a bipartisan policy. But perhaps just to point out, well, what that means. We had a previous speaker who was Sir Gus O'Donnell, who was head of the Cabinet Office, and he started his talk by saying that the first decision of a UK Prime Minister, of all UK Prime Ministers, is to instruct the submarines commanders in the nuclear submarine fleet about what they will do if the UK government is wiped out in a nuclear war, whether they will retaliate, etc. Now, obviously, you didn't have to make that decision, but what was the first decision you had to make, substantive decision, as New Zealand's Prime Minister?
Okay. Well, just to comment on the nuclear free, it is bipartisan, but you need to understand, particularly in the light of current circumstances in Europe, New Zealanders mastered the art of virtuous positions without consequence. Okay, so we're at the bottom of the world, we're shielded by Australia, we can afford all sorts of positions that aren't of great consequence. Actually, one of the first things, this is purely sort of accidental, right? It's not inherent in the duty of Prime Minister. But we had, New Zealand had troops in Afghanistan, and there was some incidents where the action of those troops was called into question, in the fog of war. And one of the first decisions I had to make was whether there would be a Royal Commission of Inquiry into those incidents, and that involved seeing the video actually of what happens when our soldiers go to war effectively in a hostile, difficult environment. And it really brought home to me the unique role of a Prime Minister, and that is ultimately that's who decides whether you go to battle. People actually got killed in it. I mean, I hadn't made the decision about that engagement, but was sort of involved in the follow-on. And I have to say it was chilling and sobering that whatever else goes on, you're making decisions about, not just about whether some, program gets money, but whether, lives are put at risk and lost in the interests, in pursuit of a generalised principle. And I doubt there's a Prime Minister on the globe who doesn't find that stressful.
That's a useful note to end it on. Obviously, these are sort of unique decisions of Prime Ministers, but look, thank you very much for the real insights you've given us. Perhaps just to end the talk, this is part of a series. I will note a couple of future speakers. We've got Feline Al-Esperance, who's speaking in early June. She's a GP in the UK and giving a perspective on how to use economics in sort of to enhance decision making. But also, we're very fortunate to have in June Dr. David Gruen, who's head of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who's made enormous strides to integrate data in Australia. And we're hoping to start a kind of dialogue with a series of both policymakers and academics about how to bring some of the things that are occurring, obviously, in New Zealand and in Australia to the UK. So thank you very much, Bill, and thanks very much, everyone. Hope to see you next time. Take care.